Well, welcome back to the farmhouse. I am just grinding some einkorn flour here. I am going to put together a loaf of einkorn sourdough bread. This will be 100% einkorn flour. First, I've got to get my bowl washed and clean. I am measuring my einkorn flour with a scale because it is fresh ground. I use 2 cups of sourdough starter, 3 cups of flour, which when it's fresh ground, you measure it in grams. So it's 360 grams of einkorn flour and 1 cup of warm water. I usually start out by mixing my sourdough starter and my water together with a Danish whisk. Then I add my flour to that, and then I just go ahead and add my salt. So this is 1.5 teaspoons of salt is what I usually use for this loaf. Could probably cut it down to a teaspoon, but I usually like 1.5 teaspoons. And then I'm just gonna stir that all together in one bowl, super easy. Nothing fancy here. And then I am going to, once I get it to a shaggy dough to where there's no dry flour left, I'm just going to cover it with a clean wet towel and set it on top of my stove to rise for hours. So I ended up putting this in the refrigerator overnight, but before I did that, I did about 3 sets of stretch and folds. Then I shaped it into this loaf pan, buttered the loaf pan, set it in there. And then I pulled it out this morning, scored it, and baked it in the oven at 375 degrees for about 35 minutes. And it's just a really great, super easy sourdough sandwich bread. And I don't like to wait to cut my sourdough loaves until after they've cooled. That's the best way to get a good picture of the inside crumb. But this is so delicious when it's fresh out of the oven, nice and warm, and your butter just melts onto each slice. So this is part of our lunch today. My husband really likes Ezekiel bread because he feels like it's super healthy, and this is taking Ezekiel bread's spot in his morning routines. Okay, so the next day I decided to make a half einkorn flour, half bread flour loaf of artesian sourdough bread. You can see that this dough is just super airy and fluffy, and that is because it's half bread flour. It's the same recipe as my whole wheat or einkorn flour loaf, but using half bread flour just makes it rise so much easier. I also like flouring just my Banneton basket and then setting a loaf in there, covering it with a wet clean towel, putting it in the refrigerator overnight, and then I just put it on my parchment paper, give it a pretty score, and bake this in my Dutch oven. When you bake something in the Dutch oven, it creates steam inside the Dutch oven, and so it rises a lot better than if you're baking it just in an open loaf pan. So you'll see that this rises much better. Of course, it's also made with bread flour. But if you want a really pretty loaf and you still want a whole grain, mix it half and half, and it just makes a really beautiful, crusty loaf. If your kids are like my kids, they don't really like butternut squash. So I kind of dreamed up this little recipe. I roasted these face down on a baking sheet for about an hour to an hour and a half at 375 degrees until they were nice and soft. I'm scooping the middles out. I'm kind of making this like a twice baked potato, but or a twice baked sweet potato, but it's twice baked butternut squash. So I'm just scooping out the insides. I used 1, 2, 3 butternut squash here, but I'm only serving them in 4 halves. I did leave some of the flesh on the skin so it held its shape. Then I'm just going to add to that about 1/4 cup of butter, about 1/3 cup of brown sugar, and about a teaspoon of salt. And I'm just going to mash this together with my fork and then reload it into these sweet potato skins and cover them in marshmallows and roast them again in the oven until they're golden brown. Sometimes I just need something that my kids will enjoy, so I'm not having to fight with them at the dinner table to eat their vegetables, and this is definitely one of them. So if you are like me and you grow a bunch of butternut squash, by now they're probably getting to the point where they need to get cooked, and so you just pull them out, chop off the ends, cut them in half, scoop out the seeds, bake them face down, and then scoop out the insides, fill them with everything you would, kind of like a sweet potato casserole filling with the brown sugar and the butter, and then fill up your skins again with that filling, load them with marshmallows, and bake them at 400 degrees for about 15 minutes, but keep an eye on them because they could burn really easy, and you just want them to be nice and browned on top. And spoiler alert, these were a hit with my kids and my husband, and I really liked them too. So we definitely will be making these again, and they will be going on the blog at farmhouseharvest.net if you want to print off the recipe. It might look like a lot of food to have one of these on your plate, but really my 6-year-old ate a whole one. On this day, I decided to make a double batch of the einkorn sourdough bread recipe. I did use some bread flour in this one, so it's super fluffy. I'm cutting it in half because I am going to make a loaf of sourdough bread, and I'm also going to make a big batch of sourdough einkorn cinnamon rolls. So I am flouring my Banneton basket so I get those really pretty lines on my sourdough loaf. I am going to knead this really quick, not really knead it, but kind of shape it, give it some tension, push it back and forth on my counter to build the tension and the shape. And then I will put it upside down in my Banneton basket so it gets the smooth side down, and then I seal the seams on top with my fingers. And just like my other loaves, I will cover it with I like to use a damp towel. I don't always use a damp towel, but using a damp towel prevents it from drying out on top. So the other half of this recipe, which is the same recipe I've shared with you, it's 2 cups of sourdough starter, 360 grams of flour, whether you're using bread flour or whole grain flour. And then I use a cup of warm water, 1.5 teaspoons of salt, and then mix that up together, do several sets of stretch and folds throughout the day. Then I'm rolling this out into a huge rectangle. It's probably 12 inches by 24 inches. And this is what I love to do. I love to put water on the dough first and then put dry cinnamon sugar. What this does is it stops any leakage of cinnamon sugar out the sides while you're cutting it or putting it in your pan. And then I like to roll it up from the small end. So it's 24 by 12. So I'm rolling it up by the 12-inch side so that it makes really big cinnamon rolls. If you love really big fluffy cinnamon rolls, then do it this way because then you have more spirals in your cinnamon roll, making it much bigger than if you would roll it up lengthwise. Another trick I like to use when making cinnamon rolls is cutting it with a string. I'm just using a cotton string that my daughter has a spool of for crocheting. You just put that where you want it. I'm doing about 1 inch wide rolls. And then cutting it this way prevents them from getting squished like they would if you cut them with a knife. It's super simple and you don't need any fancy tools to cut them this way, but it just helps your cinnamon rolls to keep their nice round shape. I did make 2 pans of this, but once I get these into a buttered casserole dish, this is making 1 13 by 9 casserole dish and then 1 8 by 8 casserole dish. All I'm showing in the video is 13 by 9. But once I get these all in there, I'm going to cover them with a clean towel and let them rise on the stove until they're nice and puffy before I put them in the oven. While those are rising, I am going to move on to a really delicious, very simple soup. I saw this on Pinterest and decided to give it a try and, of course, add my own variation to it. It's chopped up carrots or minced carrots and minced green cabbage. So I'm mincing these in the food processor, and then I chop up an onion because onion adds great flavor to just about everything, if you ask me, if it's everything savory anyways. So I'm gonna saute these onions in my Dutch oven, and then I'm going to add the minced carrots and cabbage from my food processor to the Dutch oven, and about a quart of chicken bone broth that I've had in my refrigerator. So if you think about those flavors, carrots, cabbage, and chicken broth, it sounds really good together. And so that was the main recipe base that I saw online. So I am going to add to that, because I have cooked, a few days ago, I cooked some buffalo chicken breasts, and I have a bunch of that left over in my refrigerator. I shredded it up and used it in my buffalo chicken quesadillas. You can print the recipe off for those at farmhouseharvest.net, but I decided to use the rest of it in this soup, so I am making it a buffalo chicken soup. And if you think about the buffalo flavors with the carrot, onion, and cabbage, which is really mild, it really tasted delicious together. And I just garnished the bowls with some more buffalo sauce and a few drips of ranch dressing, and it was really delicious. The color of the carrots and the cabbage and everything looks really good with the shredded chicken and the buffalo sauce in your bowl. These cinnamon rolls baked at 350 degrees for about 25 minutes till they're golden brown on top. I just made a really simple cream cheese frosting with cream cheese and maple syrup. Slathered that all over the top of these cinnamon rolls, and they were delicious. I hope that this video gave you some good ideas of things you can make for your family this week. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do, and we'll see you next time.